Good evening. Welcome to Hammond Castle. My name is Jim. My name is Jim. I'm the Special Events Manager here at Hammond Castle Museum. It is my distinct pleasure to welcome you to the first of our Gloucester 400-plus lectures series that we're having this year as part of the 400th anniversary of the founding of this great metropolis by the sea. And might as well go ahead and tell you a little bit about, before we begin, I do have to give you the boilerplate. In case of an unforeseen calamity here tonight, in case Godzilla should attack our fair castle, have no fear. There are a number of ways to get out of this room if we all need to get out in a jiff. The first is, of course, the way we all came in. Right? The second, if you go in the back on what's to my left, we have a staircase that you go up those stairs, go through the door, takes you right to the back of the lawn and out to safety. And if you're feeling adventurous, we also have up the stairs through those doors and go all the way to the back of the courtyard, and you can find yourself going through the big red fire door and once again out to safety. And of course, if we do have to escape here, I know we'll all do it in a calm and orderly fashion. Right? Awesome. Okay. You did not come here to listen to me. You came here, of course, for a lady who probably doesn't need an introduction, but I'm going to give one anyway, just in case. Ms. Mary Ellen Lepionka. Mary Ellen Lepionka is an independent scholar researching the Indigenous history of Essex County from the last ice age to around 1700. That's a lot of time, Mary Ellen. How do you keep it all in your head? Mary Ellen is a retired college instructor, textbook developer, author, and publisher with a master's degree in anthropology from Boston University and postgraduate work at the University of British Columbia. She taught cultural and physical anthropology. Consider me envious. I'm archaeology, sir. Oh, he also taught at Northeastern University, North Shore Community College, and Salem State College. Mary Ellen participated in salvage archaeology on Great Neck in Ipswich, excavated an early Iron Age Bantu refuge site in Botswana, and conducted field work in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia. Consider me impressed. Mary Ellen also had a career in higher education publishing as a developmental editor of college textbooks. Articles by Mary Ellen on local Indigenous history appear in the Bulletin of the Massachusetts Archaeological Society, the Journal of the New England Antiquities Research Association, and Northeast Anthropology. Some of her slide lectures on Indigenous peoples of Essex County, Massachusetts, have been posted on YouTube. So, without further ado, I gladly surrender the floor to Mary Ellen Lepionka.
Thank you. I'm going to tell you a story that you probably have not heard before, based on my research on the history of contact between Europeans and Indigenous people who were, in fact, living here between 1600 and 1700, roughly. So I decided to use my flipper for you. This is a new people have been occupying this area for about the last 12,000 years or more, but their deep history is really another whole story. The people who were here at the time of European contact were Eastern Woodland Indians, known as the Algonquians, and the Algonquians on Cape Ann at that time were known as the Pawtucket. The English called them the Agawam Indians, after the name of one of their villages, and they were called by other names where they happened to be found, but they were basically all the same people. At that time, this Ipswich village was the principal residence of their Sagamore or Sogma, whose name was Masquenomet, or actually it was Masquenomenet or something like that. The English referred to him as a chief, but Sagamores were not chiefs. They were stewards of their lineage and their homeland. Alliances of bands were led by people called Sachems, which we used to say sachems, but it's really Sachems, and by female leaders who were known as Salkswas, as opposed to Sachems. And these leaders were chosen from the band's high-ranking families, and the decisions were made by councils of elders and their shamans. So they did not have a top-down political organization, and their political organization was actually much more complex than the colonists understood. They were not organized as a tribe, which is a corporate entity, but as a band, which is a voluntary association of people. And their kin groups were not organized as clans. So most of our ideas that we have inherited about the people who lived here are not true or not accurate. Sovereignty was not an indigenous concept. Algonquians believed that the earth belongs to everybody, and in times of peace, indigenous peoples moved freely throughout New England, throughout the Northeast, actually. So Agawam was the name of, sure I'm doing this, of the village, and the name was also given to the larger area that refers to the Great Marsh, the salt marsh that starts above the Merrimack and ends down at the Annisquam River. The diversity of resources in and around the Great Marsh is what enabled Native people to live here year-round. They also migrated seasonally to other resources, but they were not nomads. They moved within a 25 or 30-mile radius of a major village. They came here to go clamming and fishing, to gather lobsters, seabird eggs, the feathers, wampum shells, and to hunt. They hunted marine mammals and also came here to quarry stone, of which we have a great deal, as we know. Cape Ann has indigenous quartz quarries, for example, around Goose Cove and at Andrews Point, quartz being a very prized mineral for them. By the time of English contact, they also had permanent agricultural villages on the coast, including one right here in Gloucester. The Pawtucket name for their village on the Annisquam River was originally recorded by the English prior to 1610 as Wenasquawam, which means end of the marsh. To the English, Agawam referred to the entire area from above the Merrimack River down to the Saugus River, which is what became Essex County. So we know about Wenasquawam both from archaeological and documentary evidence. It's identified in an ancient document called the Egerton manuscript that I found in the library of King Charles II of England. The document is called Ye Names of Ye Rivers and Ye Sagamores that Inhabit Upon Them. And it identifies Wenasquawam. It actually identifies all the rivers from Quebec, the one just south of St. Lawrence River down to the Annisquam River. The English changed Wenasquawam to Wanasquam, and there is written evidence of Wanasquam. In fact, Annisquam even had a Wanasquam hotel at one point that burned down, I think, in the 1960s. And then Wanasquam was further modified for Annisquam. That is the source of the name Annisquam. So this Pawtucket village is referred to as Wanasquam in colonial-era documents. I found 8 references to it in literature, including the writings of the Puritan preacher John Eliot and also Daniel Gookin, who was the first Indian agent of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, and others. And here is Wanasquam on William Wood's map of 1635. And other places. So the Pawtucket came to Essex County from the lower Merrimack Valley of New Hampshire, probably between 700 and 900 years ago. Sometimes I say 750 and 1,000 years ago. But that was when the so-called Little Ice Age was occurring. And they were farming people, and they may have been motivated by climate change to move south from the lower Merrimack Valley into Essex County in search of a longer growing season or warmer soil. They spoke an ancient form of Western Abenaki. Historical linguists refer to it as Loop B. And there were these were some of their other villages in the area between Lake Winnipesaukee and Salem Sound. This represented approximately 20,000 people. A major hub for the Pawtucket was the Merrimack River, was the Wamisit at the junction of Concord and Merrimack Rivers, which is Lowell today. People canoed to the coast via the Merrimack and also via the Parker, Ipswich, and Essex rivers. The Pawtucket dug canals to facilitate canoe travel from the mouth of the Merrimack to the Annisquam River. They could get from one place to the other without having to go into the open ocean. We also built causeways through the marshes for travel by foot. The causeway to Rocky Neck and the causeway from Rust Island to West Gloucester were originally built by Indigenous people here. You can't really read this map here, but the turquoise blue lines are canoe routes, and the green lines are their overland trails. The Squam Trail is Route 127 today. The Agawam Trail is Route 1A. The Abenaki Trail is Route 133. And there was also a Namkiak Trail that went from Beverly-Salem to villages in Andover and Lawrence and Pawtucket Falls on the Merrimack River. Hundreds, or actually thousands, it was reported, of families would gather annually at Pawtucket Falls for the spring fish run. This is what pre-agricultural Pawtucket and Pennacook villages would have looked like. The one on the left is based on an archaeological site in North Andover. In 1614, Captain John Smith sailed by our coast and saw the Pawtucket villages here and commented on them, but the first Europeans that we know of that set foot here were with the French explorer Samuel de Champlain, not Vikings. Contrary to local legend, I worked really hard on this, but I found absolutely no evidence for Vikings being here, and Thorvald Eriksson is not buried on the Bat Shore. He was not here in 1004. So sorry. The Rockport people were unhappy about this because their football team was called the Vikings. When Champlain visited Cape Ann in 1604 and in 1606, he found Pawtucket settlements at Whale Cove in Rockport and on Fisherman's Field and Smith Cove in Gloucester Harbor. The French made sketches of the Indigenous people they met here. Champlain called them the Almuchiquois and described their agricultural practices. In the left panel, the woman is holding an ear of corn in one hand and a squash in the other, a winter squash. Jerusalem artichokes are growing between her and her husband, who has his hunting gear and his turkey feathers. He has a bow and arrow, a fish spear, and a knife. Looks like a steel knife that he likely got through the fur trade. In the panel on the right, the woman grinding corn in a hollowed tree trunk was identified by Champlain as having been seen on Cape Ann, which Champlain called the Cap aux Îles, the Cape of Islands. According to Champlain's journal, they were lost at sea in 1604. They were off Sandy Bay. They were worried about all the rocks in the water. They sailed past Pawtucket smoke signals at the headlands at Long Cove, but they responded to the smoke signals at Emerson Point and came ashore at Whale Cove. The Indigenous people there and throughout the coast on the Gulf of Maine were all very familiar with Europeans. Europeans had been fishing there and interacting with them for 100 years previous. In Whale Cove, the Pawtucket drew a map for Champlain, which is on the right, showing where they were and what the shoreline looked like to the south, and including the islands in Boston Bay. So the Pawtucket were very knowledgeable about the geography of where they were and the Indigenous people who lived all around them, the Massachusetts being a different group of people speaking a different language. The Massachusetts to the south and the Nipmuc to their west were close allies of the Pawtucket, and they were bonded through marriages of alliance. Champlain returned in 1606 and made this map, you've probably seen it, of Gloucester Harbor, which he called Lerbeau-Port, showing Pawtucket wigwams and corn patch gardens. He counted 200 people around the harbor there. He anchored in the lee of 10-Pound Island and came ashore at Rocky Neck. The Sagamore here at that time, according to Champlain, was Quiohamanek. And Quiohamanek asked Champlain to stick around for another few days because another 2,000 people were coming to greet him, to welcome him. Champlain was looking for a good place to have a capital for New France, to be financed through the fur trade. But he wrote the people at Lerbeau-Port were only interested in fishing and farming, and that they had already hunted out most of their beavers and muskrat. Otherwise, we might be celebrating the 417th anniversaire of Beauport instead of the 400th anniversary of Gloucester. As it was, Champlain did not stick around for another 2,000 people to welcome him. He thought they were planning an ambush. They were probably just overjoyed because the French were handing out not only steel knives, but also copper pots, wool socks, and they were trading guns for furs. There's Rocky Neck in the inset. The Pawtucket are dancing in a little circle to the right in Smith Cove. Champlain is in the middle, freaking out because Indians in a canoe appear to be cutting off his exit and access to his vessel. He calls to his lieutenant, Poutrincourt, who calls out their 8 Marines to head off any ambush attempt. The Marines are on the left at the bottom. They're formed up with their rifles, their muskets over their shoulders. But Champlain's adventures are another whole story that we don't really have time for today. We've all heard about the Dorchester Company and how they landed at Fisherman's Field in 1623. During the 3 seasons that the English stayed at Fisherman's Field, they traded with the Pawtucket for food and furs, and they lived in the Pawtucket's wigwams. Roger Conant complained to John White, the founder of the Dorchester Company, that there were too many fleas in the wigwams. We know they were living in the wigwams. They modified the wigwams to have chimneys and doors. And it wasn't until 1640 that the Massachusetts Bay Colony said that Englishmen should be living in proper homes and should stop living in wigwams. Whereupon the first home was built actually in Manchester by William Allen in 1640. That was an aside. Back to my notes. See what I mean about notes? The Dorchester Company people were not the first English to live on Cape Ann. Plymouth Colony already had seasonal fishing stations all along the coast. They had a fishing station at Gap Cove at Straitsmouth, for example. And there were also, independent entrepreneurs with their fishing camps, for example, in Lobster Cove. And there were some independents, and one of them was, for example, William Jeffreys. He was a survivor of the failed Wessagusset colony, which had been attempted down at Quincy and Weymouth. And he purchased land from the Pawtucket directly from the Indians in 1623 and 1624, well before the Mass Bay Colony was established. He bought Jeffrey's Neck, which is Great Neck today in Ipswich. He bought Jeffrey's Ledge, which is a fishing station just off the coast in Ipswich. And he bought Jeffrey's Creek, which is what became Manchester by the Sea. So the story of the Dorchester Company begins with Reverend John White's dream of planting a Puritan colony in America. He was the rector of the Holy Trinity Church in Dorset in Dorchester, England. The Puritans were loyal to the crown, but they wanted to reform the Church of England to change the way the state religion was being conducted. The Pilgrims, in contrast, wanted to separate from the Church of England and start their own religions, and they were generally opposed to the monarchy. So the Puritans and the Pilgrims were different groups, and those are among the differences that led to the English Civil War that began in 1641. 1641 was the same year that Gloucester Plantation was officially authorized to become a township. White planned for his American colony to be supported by fishing. At that time, Europe's Atlantic fisheries had become depleted from overfishing. Their fleets were having to fish as far away as Newfoundland, Casco Bay, and Ipswich Bay. Demand for fish was very high in all of Europe's Catholic countries. And this is what an ideal 17th century fishing station was supposed to look like, with facilities for extracting codfish oil, whale oil, drying fish flakes on stages, packing salt cod. White persuaded his friends, family, parishioners, merchants, and a local earl to invest in the venture. In 1622, they raised £1,000. They bought a small 50-ton ship called the Fellowship and applied to the Crown for a fishing license and permission to found a colony on Cape Ann. In 1623, they set sail, landed in Gloucester Harbor, perhaps at Half Moon Beach. They fished, then they went home, leaving 14 men to winter over on Fisherman's Field. The men, according to John White's journal, were supposed to prepare a flake yard, construct salt barrels and fish boxes, and make salt for the fishery. They were also supposed to prepare ground for planting and begin erecting a meeting house with oak framing timbers that they had brought with them from England. The Fellowship was late to their market, which was in Seville, Spain, with the first season's fish, and they barely covered their costs. John White then formed a joint stock company called the Dorchester Company, with a home port in Weymouth in England's West Country. They were called the Dorchester Company Adventurers. They originally consisted of 119 investors, including 5 women of means, and they each paid £25 per share. They raised around £3,000, and the next spring the company sent 3 ships with supplies, settlers, cattle, and goods for trade with the Pawtucket on Cape Ann. There was the Fellowship, a smaller vessel called the Amity, and a newly acquired 150-ton, 40-ton vessel, a Flemish flyboat called the Zouch Phoenix. The Zouch Phoenix had extra decks built on it for the people and for the cattle, but it sprang a leak and had to return to port. In that second season, the ships fished on Stellwagen Bank, but they were again late to their market in Seville, and when they got there, they discovered that the port had been closed because, unbeknownst to them, in 1624, England had declared war with Spain. For the next season, the Dorchester Company secured a consignment for their fish in Bordeaux, France, instead. These 16 people, and possibly others, came to Cape Ann on the Zouch Phoenix. Passengers included people from England, people from the failed colony of West Gloucester who had taken refuge at Plymouth, and a couple of people from Plymouth. They joined the first season's 14 fishermen. Most sources say that the wintering overpopulation for the second season numbered 30 to 32, quote, men, end of quote. Thomas Gardner was assigned to manage the plantation, and John Tilley was assigned to manage the fishery. In the summer of 1624, at least 24 men, 2 women, and 6 children were camped in Fisherman's Field. Roughly 100 vessels were fishing off the coast of Massachusetts at that time. Here are Gloucester residents in 1907 at Cressy's Beach. They're dedicating the plaque on Tablet Rock in Stage 4 Park in honor of that settlement. The plaque is a little off because the Dorchester Company was not the first permanent settlement, because they abandoned Cape Ann the following year. Plymouth Plantation, Salem Village, and Dover, New Hampshire were the first permanent resident settlements. This is where the Dorchester Company was attempting to plant and build a fishing station. They were trying to grow English barley there with imported seed. By the end of the 1624 season, they were starting to die. They were saved from starvation through bartering with the local Pawtucket for their maize, or Indian corn, which they complained did not taste as good as their good old English rye. John White set relief in the spring, and all 3 vessels immediately went fishing, determined not to be late this time. They sailed to Newfoundland, where they knew they would find plenty of fish. And they did. They took so many that they had to discard some. They loaded all the fish into the biggest vessel, which was the Zouch Phoenix, for the voyage back. But the master unaccountably sailed her to their home port in Weymouth instead of bringing the catch to its market in Bordeaux. And by the time the fish got to where they were supposed to be, they were rotten, as well as late, and fetched a rock-bottom price. Meanwhile, the settlers at Fisherman's Field were in trouble. According to John White's account, the men assigned to the fishery did not want to help with planting crops. The men assigned to the plantation wanted nothing to do with the fish, and the man in charge of making salt by evaporation from boiled seawater was a drunkard and a bully. Barrels of salt were having to be imported at great cost. This is a conjecture of what the Dorchester Company's books might have looked like based on the account. They broke even the first year, had to borrow to keep going, and took a big loss in the 3rd season, even after selling the 3 ships. William Bradford wrote a letter to John Winthrop praising the Dorchester Company for managing to pay off their debt within 2 years through trade with the Pawtucket on Cape Ann. But that was later. In the fall of 1625, John White declared bankruptcy. He sent a letter to one of the investor's relatives at Plymouth, who was Roger Conant, asking him to protect the company's assets at Fisherman's Field and to lead any settlers who elected to stay. The Amity and the Fellowship were sent with relief supplies and instructions to bring back to England any of the colonists who wanted to come home. By the time John White received Roger Conant's letter accepting the mission, Conant and his party of an estimated 18 people had already arrived on Cape Ann. They found the people in bad shape and realized they would not last the winter on Fisherman's Field. Conant wrote to John White that the place was too rocky, the soil was too poor, the fishing grounds were too far away, and the people were too uncooperative with each other. Although they had managed to erect a meeting house, the fishing station and the plantation were not happening, so they were leaving. Before they left, Conant was involved in a confrontation that took place on Fisherman's Field. When they found out about the bankruptcy, some of the original Dorchester Company investors sued to try to recover their investments, and others actually tried to confiscate company assets at Fisherman's Field. They hired men to come up from Plymouth to do just that, and a plaque on Fisherman's Field commemorates that confrontation. But the plaque oversimplifies things a bit. The dispute was not over a fishing stage. Some of the West Country investors hired a Welshman at Plymouth by the name of John Hughes to seize the assets at Fisherman's Field on their behalf. When Plymouth's governor, William Bradford, heard about it, he sent Miles Standish to Fisherman's Field to protect Plymouth's interests there. Standish threatened to open fire on Hughes and his men, who were entrenched behind some barrels of salt that they were confiscating. John White later sued to get back what they took in the salt. Conant interceded and reminded them that under English bankruptcy law, everything there was Dorchester Company property until the court ruled on the case. And with that, all the parties dispersed. So there were really three factions, not two. They were contending for all of the Dorchester Company assets, not just a stage. And in addition, Plymouth was trying to enforce its own prior claim to all of Cape Ann based on an invalidated document called the Sheffield Charter. History is actually more complex than we usually are allowed to know. So Reverend John White kept his dream alive by forming a new joint stock company, which he called the New England Company. This other plaque is also a little bit inaccurate. They have John Hughes building the first fort. It was Hughes who had made a trench and put up barrels of salt to protect themselves from Miles Standish. That was not the first fort. The first fort was not built until 1628, or later, and it was by John Endicott. I won't go into detail there. In any case, in the fall of 1625, Roger Conant and a Pawtucket guide led the Dorchester Company people who had chosen to remain, driving their cattle before them 12 miles south to the Pawtucket village of Nomkiak, or Nahumkiak. It was Nahumkiak. The colonists called it Nomkiak. That village was on the Bass River in North Beverly at the outflow of Wenham Lake. By the time John White received Conant's letter stating his intention to abandon Cape Ann, they had already arrived at this Pawtucket village. White's reply begs Conant to keep the colony alive, even if only 3 men of substance agree to accompany him. And the 3 men of substance were John Woodbury, John Balch, and Peter Palfrey. In the spring of 1626, the relief ships that White had sent did not find anybody at Fisherman's Field. And they were frantically looking for them and miraculously discovered them down the coast at Beverly Harbor. According to their accounts, they had survived the winter there through the hospitality and the generosity of the Pawtucket at Nahumkiak. This is the route that Conant's party took: Old Salem Road through Ravenswood to Route 127, which was the Indian Trail. They referred to their settlement as Bass River, and then later they called it Cape Ann Side, and then they changed the name to Salem Village. After new settlers arrived at Salem Village, some of the original settlers returned up the coast to strike out on their own. For example, William Allen and his brothers started a fishing camp and sawmill at Jeffreys Creek. And Walter Knight brought his wife and children to homestead in Magnolia. Fisherman's Field is in Stage Fort Park. So the Dorchester Company people, let's see, this is not, right. At Salem Village lived and planted peacefully side by side with the Pawtucket at Nahumkeag for the next 30 years or so. In 1627, John White sent the Peter, a 40-ton vessel, the Happy Entrance, 20 tons, to resupply Conant's party at Salem Village. Then in 1628, the governor of the new New England Company, John Endicott, arrived, and he moved the seat of government across the river to present-day Salem. So Salem Village and present-day Salem are two different places. The very next year, new settlers arrived in the so-called Higginson fleet. This was 350 people in 6 ships with livestock. The New England Company morphed into the Massachusetts Bay Company that year, and in 1630, they sent John Winthrop to govern it. Winthrop moved the seat of colonial government from Salem to Dorchester with a port at Roxbury. Meanwhile, both Endicott and Conant stayed on to govern at Salem and Cape Ann. And the original settlers of Salem Village came to be known as the Old Planters. And theirs is also another whole story. The Pawtucket names for these rivers in the Salem colony were recorded in the Mass Bay Colony's first grant of land to John Endicott. The grant was for the peninsula between the Waters River and the Crane River, where he grew his famous pear tree. Going clockwise from the village of Nahumkeag to the village of Wakwamisecock are the Waquack, or the Bass River, the Orcasant, which is the Danvers River, the Massapequash, which is the Forest River, the Soamapanesset, which is the North River, the Connemaups-Ganukin, which is the Waters River, and the Puamanukan, or the Crane River. One of the first things John Endicott did in 1628 was to survey Cape Ann for a plantation and a cut. The prospect of linking Ipswich Bay to Massachusetts Bay was what made Cape Ann such a desirable location for a colony. By making the cut, ships going to ports between Canada and Virginia could avoid being wrecked on our notorious coast, which was already littered with shipwrecks. Endicott surveyors met Pawtucket families living on the Jones River salt marsh behind Wingersheek Beach. The surveyors asked them the name of Cape Ann, which of course would not have been a concept for them, and they gave them the name of their settlement, which was Wigawachik. Comes down to us as Wingersheek. The next thing Endicott did was to purchase and lease land from the Cape Ann Pawtucket. He wrote to Governor John Winthrop that he had bought, quote, the hoed land, end quote, from the Indians. Extra land that the indigenous farmers had cleared and prepared for cultivation, but had not yet planted. It was customary to prepare land years in advance of planting in it to improve the soil. It was part of their agricultural practice. They cleared land using the slash and burn method, mixed and mounded the potash from the burned wood with the soil, and then would build in moisture into the mounds by raking up the soil of the mounds after each rainfall. Indigenous people saw this as a way to ensure future harvests, but colonists saw it as wasteful. The hoed land that Endicott acquired was along the Mill River in Riverdale, Poplar Street, Washington Street, and Cherry Street, including the site around Grant Circle that became Gloucester Plantation. Endicott's deal included annual payments of tribute in the form of bushel baskets of Indian corn, and this meant that in exchange for giving up the land, the Pawtucket could have some of the corn that they would have grown on it. This deal lasted off and on for about the next 30 years. Endicott also laid out house lots, thatch lots, and wood lots for the colonists who would be coming to Gloucester Plantation. Unlike the Pilgrims at Plymouth, the Puritans who settled Cape Ann were not fleeing from religious persecution. They were coming for economic opportunity, and mainly to farm. The earliest deeds and court cases on the records are all about establishing fences and rights of way so that everybody could get to all their allotments as well as to the waterfront without trespassing. And this goes on, the cases. All land was owned and allocated by the government and could be bought and sold only by permission of the general court of the government. The Pawtucket welcomed the English with open arms. They were eager for the English to settle among them for their technology and for their protection against their own native enemies. The earliest records of English Pawtucket encounters on Cape Ann are about protecting the Pawtucket from both their native enemies and the colonists. The colonists' free-ranging cattle and pigs were destroying the Pawtucket cornfields and clam flats. And one of the earliest rulings of the general court is to require the colonists to ring their swine or to segregate them so that they would not destroy the clam flats. And the colonists also had to help the Indians build fences. So there was some attempt to be accommodating in the situation. Wait, I have to go back to my notes. That was an aside. Okay. All right. So, in 1630, when John Winthrop arrived on the Arbella as the first governor of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, Masconomet rowed out or canoed out to welcome him. Winthrop was not impressed. He wrote in his diary only that some Indians came aboard and tiresomely stayed all day. He had his men give them some biscuit and trinkets bought for the purpose of establishing friendly contact. Between 1630 and 1638, when Gloucester Plantation was being resettled, events led Masconomet to sell Greater Agawam from the Merrimack to the Saugus to Governor Winthrop's son, John Winthrop, Jr. Those events included Tarantine raids against the Pawtucket at Agawam Village, a devastating smallpox epidemic, and the Pequot War in Connecticut, in which survivors were shipped to slave plantations in the Caribbean, and the Pequot Nation was declared extinct. The Pawtucket enemies on the east, known as the Tarantines, who were the Micmac or the Mi'kmaq, the Maliseet, or actually the Wolastoqiyik, the Passamaquoddy or Peshtimakati from Nova Scotia and the Canadian Maritimes, and sometimes also the Penobscot or Penawapskek of northern Maine. These people annually raided coastal farms to their south, as far as Nantucket, for corn, because corn would not grow at their high latitudes. Pawtucket arch-enemies on the west were the Iroquoian-speaking peoples, or the Haudenosaunee, especially the Mohawk or the Kanien'kehá:ka. They wanted greater access to the fur trade in the Connecticut Valley and to shells on the New England coast. In addition to having cultural value, the shell beads known as wampum or wampumpiag were legal tender for both Indians and colonists between 1630 and 1661. The Pawtucket were also in the middle of ongoing competition between the French, the English, and the Dutch for New England land, forts, and commodities: furs, metal oils, ores, sassafras as a cure for syphilis, hemp, pine tar, and timber for the king's navies. Governor Winthrop sent his son to survey Agawam for a plantation. I'm probably out of sync now with the slides, Agawam became Ipswich, and it was principally to establish a buffer zone against the French. In 1631 and again in 1632 and 1635, Winthrop Jr. and men from Charlestown and Chabaco aided Masconomet against Tarentine attacks. In 1637, in gratitude, he granted land to Winthrop Jr. He sold Winthrop Jr. Castle Hill, his farm on Ardula Road, and the land between Labor and Bain Creek and Chabaco Creek, which is the Essex River. And he also invited the English to occupy his fort, which was on Castle Island in the Castle Neck River. He would have had watchtowers and a fort guarding the entrance of the Annisquam River as well, for example, where the Annisquam Lighthouse is today. All of the tidal rivers where there were settlements had forts and watchtowers against, as protection against Tarentine attack. Because of population loss through disease and growing economic dependency through the loss of land, the Pawtucket families began moving away. Those who stayed faced increasing pressure from a rapid influx of English colonists. They risked becoming dependent on the charity of the towns. Some Pawtucket did assimilate. They converted to Christianity, adopted colonial dress, fenced their farms, raised cattle, and intermarried with indentured servants or African slaves. The Dutch had introduced slavery in Boston in 1619. Some Pawtucket indentured themselves to English families as servants or as apprentices in the maritime trades, or especially as tanners or wet leather workers. In 1638, Masconomet sold the rest of what would become Essex County to John Winthrop Jr. for another £20. This is Alan Pearsall's mural down on Riverwalk in Ipswich, showing Masconomet signing over the deed to Greater Agawam. In addition to being grateful for English help, the Sagamore probably also wanted to stay on their good side because he would have known about what happened to the Pawtucket, to the Pequot. In 1639, the General Court invited a wealthy shipping magnate to make the cut and turn Gloucester into an international harbor or port of trade. This was Maurice Thompson, and Endicott had warehouses erected for Thompson on Duncan's Point, which is today Harbor Loop. Thompson did not come, however. He had more lucrative projects elsewhere, such as gold down on the coast of Central America and silver mines in the West Indies. Then in 1641, immigration to Cape Ann and investment in Cape Ann by England's nobles stopped because of the English Civil War. Gloucester incorporated as a town the next year and tried to accomplish the cut by itself. Through the unpaid labor of a Puritan minister being cast out of Marshfield and his entourage, and that was Richard Blinman, for whom the cut is named, and that too is another whole story. This is a detail from John Mason's 1830 map of Gloucester. The land that Endicott initially bought from the Pawtucket included the site of Gloucester Plantation. The Pawtucket village of Wanasquam or Wanasquewam was in Riverview, just north of Pole Hill, and vestiges of that village probably lie under Brown's Field on Wheeler Street and around that little heron pond that's there. Wheeler's Point, the entire tip of the peninsula, is the eroding remains of a massive shell heap, an accumulation of thousands of years of indigenous occupation. Pole Hill served indigenous people as a astronomical observatory, and probably also as a ceremonial gathering place. Their cornfields were under the middle school grounds, the Public Works Department, Veterans Way, and that would have been before there was a mill pond, because it would have been before there was a mill dam. You can still see sight lines for the solstices and equinoxes on Pole Hill, and there are modified boulders there and elsewhere on Cape Ben that represent Algonquian beliefs about the spirit world. These are two of the alignments, the summer solstice sunrise on the left and winter solstice sunset on the right. In 1642, John Winthrop Jr. disarmed Masconomet's band for fear of uprisings, such as had occurred earlier in the Pequot War. Masconomet went to court to petition to get their guns back and to ask again for English protection, which was granted, but with conditions. In 1644, Masconomet and several other Sagamores and Sockums, and the Massachusetts salt squaw known as Squaw Sockham, who was the widow of Nanepashemet, they all formally signed an oath of allegiance to the British Crown. This was a major turning point. On March 8, 1644, they appeared in the Mass Bay Colony Circuit Court at Salem. Governor John Winthrop and the Puritan minister John Mather were there. Richard Mather were there. With Masconomet were Cuchamacan of Cochituic, which is present-day Andover, Josias Chickatawbut of Nonantum, present-day Newton and Brookline, Neshakawam of Nashua, New Hampshire, a Pennacook, Wassamagan of Wachusett, a Dipmut, and the Nanepashemet Sonksquaw. Sometime later, Passaconaway, or Papissakanua, and his eldest son, Nanemakamuk, also signed this oath of 1644. They were all joined in a confederacy known as the Pennacook Confederacy. But English protection came at a price. In addition to becoming Christians and obeying the Ten Commandments and observing the Sabbath and having their children instructed in how to be English, they also had to refrain from behavior that the Puritans regarded as immoral, and that included sorcery, blasphemy, idleness, nudity, dancing, fornication, bestiality, and other specified sex acts. Court records show that the Pawtucket briefly did receive equal justice under English law, but the Oath of 1644 did not protect their interests as Indigenous people. Overnight, powwows were declared illegal. Indians were not allowed to own boats or horses or to learn trades or to earn money. Indians could be forced to work for colonists against their will. By the late 1670s, Indigenous people in Essex County had either left the area or made themselves invisible, or they were being kept as poor farm workers or as slaves. The first generation of the early colonial period were dying off, and it's good that Masconomet did not live to see the end of days for the Pawtucket in Massachusetts. He had given his children Christian names, received a Christian burial in 1658. His English grave site, along with that of his wife and other relatives, are on Sagamore Hill in South Hamilton, which is under the stewardship of Indigenous caretakers and the Essex County Greenbelt Association. After his death, people in southern Essex County came under the aegis of the heirs of Nanepashemet, the youngest son, Wennepoiken, or Sagamore George. People in northern Essex and northern Middlesex County came under the aegis of the heirs of Passaconaway. These lineages of Masconomet, Nanepashemet, Passaconaway, and the others all have living descendants today. The Indian agent Daniel Buchan and the Puritan minister John Eliot had tried to protect the Indians by establishing praying Indian villages for Christian converts, towns where they could learn how to assimilate. Wamisit and Lowell was the praying Indian village designated for the Pawtucket on Cape Ann. It was one of the 7 original praying towns. But in the aftermath of another major war, or say the major war called King Philip's War, the colonists burned Wamisit down, actually sacked it twice. Massachusetts' commitment to assimilating indigenous people had included establishing an Indian college at Harvard, where selected men could become literate in English, also Latin, Hebrew, and Greek. And they could train to become Christian missionaries to go among their own people. Some of them did. And although the Pennacook and the Pawtucket had striven to remain neutral, after this King Philip's War, all Indians came to be seen as enemies of the English. Even the Harvard grads were at risk. According to our history books, this is the praying Indian villages. I think I'm not really clicking properly. According to our history books, in 1675, the second son of the Pokanoket chief, Massasoit, or Usamequin, started a war in Rhode Island that engulfed all of New England. The son was Metacomet, whom the English called King Philip. This war became known as King Philip's War, or the Wampanoag War against the English. However, it turns out that in reality, it was Plymouth Colony's war against the Wampanoag for their land, which Metacomet was trying to defend. That war is another whole presentation that there's not time for. Surviving males of fighting age were shipped to plantations in Jamaica, Bermuda, and Barbados as slaves. Many indigenous people in southern New England today have African ancestry. Quotas of captured women and children were given to the towns in proportion to their contribution to the war effort, to do with as they wished. The war lasted only a year, but fighting continued on the frontiers and at sea in the Gulf of Maine for another 100 years. During that time, Massachusetts off and on paid bounties for Indian scalps and indiscriminately sold Indians into slavery. Surviving groups were forced onto reservations. Whenever it was safe to do so, some Pawtucket families returned to their homelands back and forth and back and forth. But within 10 years following King Philip's War, the settlements were all abandoned. It wasn't safe for anyone. Even the Pawtucket scouts, guides, interpreters, and spies who had served on the front lines with the English against the Wampanoag. Also, defeated and dislocated participants in that war, referred to as strange Indians, sought asylum among those who had not participated, which made neutrality impossible. In 1682, the Gloucester Selectmen voted to ask residents to distinguish between strange Indians and, quote, the Indians who live among us, end of quote. In 1684, the Selectmen voted again to ask the residents to refrain from vigilantism against, quote, the Indians who live among us, end of quote. But there is no record of how residents responded, and there are pages torn out of those records. Those are the only references to Indigenous people in the entire Gloucester archives. So thoroughly has evidence of their presence here been erased. In all times and places, official history is written by people of power, which is why we must always question our history. And real history resides within a multiverse that we all share. In 1700 and 1701, Masconomet's grandchildren signed quitclaim deeds to each of the towns that had been formed from the Agawam land that Masconomet had originally deeded. The General Court ordered Gloucester to pay £7 sterling as a final installment for its 10,000 acres, including Essex. Gloucester residents were taxed to make up that amount of the settlement, and Massachusetts subsequently embarked on an official campaign of extermination against the Indigenous people of New England. And to survive, many Indigenous people stopped practicing their religion, stopped speaking their language, and stopped telling their children who they were. And this is, I guess I went one beyond. This is the quitclaim deed to Gloucester. The village of Wanasquam was most likely abandoned in 1686. The last reference to it is in this book. A visitor from England, John Dutton, he was a bookseller, and he had come to check out the Cape Ann or New England market. He describes a woebegone Indian village in Gloucester with the people in the process of leaving it. And they're in mourning paint, black paint, for the loss of an important person. So there were a number of important deaths that year for Indigenous people. One was Daniel Boone, the great friend and protector of the Indians, who was very widely mourned by Indigenous people. Also, the youngest Nanapashamit son, Sagamore George, died the previous year after returning home from Jamaica, where he had been enslaved and was released through Daniel Gubin's efforts. He also got his wife and children back, too. Gubin also retrieved, and that year, Passacatoaway's youngest son, whose name was Wanalancet, sold the last of the Petticoat Pawtucket homelands around Wamisik and led survivors to Canada. So there's no formal record of it, but I'm making 1686 as the time when Wanasquam in Riverview was last occupied by Indigenous people. So this is an idea of the extent of the Pawtucket diaspora. Some went to their Massachusetts relatives at Natick or to their Nipmuc relatives at Hassanamisa and Grafton, or they went to the Mohicans at Schaghticoke, New York, and Stockbridge. Those ones were later removed as far west as Wisconsin after President Andrew Jackson's Indian Removal Act of 1830. Others sought refuge with the Missisquoi or the Sokoke up on Lake Champlain, with the Pequawket or other Abenaki in the White Mountains. Many went to French missions in Quebec, Canada. People here from Agawam ended up in Odanak in Quebec. Some even found refuge with former enemies. They joined, for example, the Penobscot at Indian Island in Maine, or they went to the Kanawaki or Akwesasne Mohawk in upstate New York. Others joined the Wabanaki or the Wampanoag resistance movements, which carried on for another 100 years. The Wabanaki attacked fishing outposts and they kidnapped and ransomed Gloucester fishermen in the Gulf of Maine, and they pirated their vessels. Descendants of this diaspora are living today throughout the Northeast. They are also living in Wisconsin, and they are also living on islands in the Caribbean. In 2010, in that census, there were 2,718 residents of Essex County who identified as Native American or Alaska Native. And the people with Indigenous ancestry is probably much higher, as people with DNA kits or ancestry accounts are finding out. And the map on the right is from the 2020 census showing the towns in Essex County that reported who have greater numbers of Indigenous people. You could see Gloucester is one of them. So through sheer resilience, Indigenous people survived 500 years of European contact. The people in Wisconsin, they're in a procession with their prayer feather prayer wands, and their shaman. The shaman is wearing the black bear regalia of Masconomet's lineage. The people on St. David's Island in Bermuda are descendants of Pennacook who were shipwrecked there on their way to a slave plantation. Indigenous landscapes are always also here. The forests and the lakes and the rivers, the lands held as wildlife refuges and conservation land. Their stones are still here, spirit rocks and portals between the sky world and the water world. And the stones of their ancestors are hidden in plain sight all around us. These are some surviving Indigenous landscapes around Cape Ann. We're going to the end. So Indigenous people are still here. Our narratives of erasure were wrong that told us, oh, there were no Indians here by the time the English settled. They had disappeared or died out with disease. Not true. Their powwows are celebrations of their survival and a means by which they attempt to reconstruct, share, and transmit a cultural heritage that could not be extinguished after all. Thank you. Are there questions? Yes?
And usually for the use of the word Indian.
Well, I'm sorry. No, that's all right. It's Columbus thought he had arrived at India, and it became a custom to refer to the people as Indian.
More like now, today.
It's changed to, at first it was Native American. Americans themselves decided they didn't like that because America is not an Indigenous concept. So they prefer just the term Indigenous peoples, capital I for Indigenous, capital P for peoples, Indigenous peoples. And that's their preference first. That's a Canadian expression, and that's certainly the people in New England would like that. Both the Wampanoag and the Abenaki claim to be the people of the dawn. So,
but the best term to use is Indigenous.
Yes, Indigenous people. That other question? Yeah. The shift that Winter played? The what? Oh, the fellowship came first. Got. Oh, then there was the Amity, which was the little one that they used for rescues, so on, and then Hazach Phoenix. That Phoenix, C-O-U-C-H, and then Phoenix as in the verb.
Could you repeat what you said about the difference between the Pilgrims versus the Puritans?
Right. The Puritans were loyalists, and they were only wanting to reform the Church of England, which they thought was becoming too much like Roman Catholicism. So they wanted to make it less, quote, popish, false. And the Pilgrims, had a much stronger reaction. They didn't want to have the Church of England at all. They wanted that to be, they wanted it to be strictly optional what you have to do with it. Everybody does their own thing. And they were not in favor of the monarchy. So that bore itself out of the English Civil War, where you had the Cavaliers of the Roundheads was the same set of sides. So the Cavaliers were Puritans, some men. Is that right? and have Bradford. I forget who had which hat. Whether they were the round hats or the Calvin, but anyway. And that, began with the beheading of King Charles I. Then you have the direct period with Oliver Cromwell's. Then you have the restoration of the monarchy with Charles II, which I think doesn't happen until 1669. So there was this period where you had a lot of people immigrating, but you had no attention from anything as to what was happening, and you had no investing. The people that were coming were landless farmers looking for economic opportunity. And you mentioned that the Indians were not chiefs but stewards, so they kind of is going. Well, all right, here of a chief is fixed on European history, where chieftain was the top dog, and it was the top guy. Very the Sadabalar actually saw them as well. They were they came from species that were eligible for leadership, true inherited status, but they were chosen by councils of elders, who were also advised by a shaman as to who should lead here in given time, and that nobody had to obey this. You didn't have to do what Sagor said, that you get to like the agreed to stick your own thing anyway, somewhat man, or you joined a different flag. Sorry. So it's a different type of political organization that we know of from European history, because chiefs to solve. And so women aren't this absolutely free. And the reason why we didn't know that is because history was written inside by no dad, by that. So the tickets to when you start to study, for example, pitfalls it turns out they were ensuring the very important salt squad at school responsible for saving the lives of hundreds of people through later decisions to lure the listeners of their advance. They're the ends of the ones that have survived. Yeah, so it's good for hear of us. But you see that all in the history of charities still referred to the old witch diamond and I ended. At least or something like that. Ever thus. I claim this ever thus. Can you speak to the appropriateness? Well, that's a really good point. It is useful to acknowledge that we are living on indigenous land, and quite often it's land that was never properly seeded at all. But a lot of people, for a lot of organizations in Kansas, just lip service. There's no real social justice behind it. It's just words. Some of it's ridiculous. Some of the wording is real silly in the way they put it. Indigenous websites give advice on what to say and not to say, and a land acknowledgement statement.